As I said, my name is Anneka, and I work at Cliff College. I'm actually from Ripley, just down the road near Derby, but I now live in Sheffield, so I'm in Bleedless, only 10 minutes away. Drive through Johnfield every day to get to work. I live in Sheffield with my husband and my brother and his 2 cats. I go to church in Fir Vale, in a church plant in sort of East Sheffield. And if my voice sounds slightly hoarse, it's because I was at the Sheffield Steelers ice hockey match last night. I was screaming for quite a while. They won, so it's really a pleasure to be invited to speak to Resonate. Anybody who reaches out to us and says, we need a slightly more diverse lineup, would you mind preaching, has my vote, so that's great. I was given a free range topic and chose Jesus and grief. I appreciate that's challenging. I don't know what your circumstances are, what you're going through. If you need to leave the room at any point or want to burst into tears and stay where you are, that's absolutely fine. Please, this is a space where you can feel free to let God work in you and let the word work in you. I don't know if you're familiar with this painting. I wouldn't call myself an art aficionado by any means, but this is The Deluge by Francis Danby. Just take a minute and sort of observe the picture. What jumps out to you? Is there anything in particular that kind of catches your eye?
Carnage.
Carnage, yeah. The angel, so this angel here, yeah. Anything else?
Red bit.
Yeah, this bit.
The red bit.
The red bit.
Oh, the red bit. Oh, yes. I don't know what that is actually. That's not okay to me. It could well be the sun. So this picture hangs in Tate, and I saw it many, many years ago. And just like you, the angel at this bottom corner caught my eye. And it's a picture of a flood narrative, and it looks totally like carnage. It's totally full on. Apart from the ark in the back corner here, and this angel weeping over a body. As we consider grief this evening, I'd like you to keep in mind that death was not part of God's good plan for his good world. Death came into the world as a consequence of sin. It is a distortion of the good world that God created for us. And I like to think that the angel weeping represents something of how God feels about death being part of our world. We don't like talking about bad stuff in church, do we? We don't like the negative emotions, the sad stories. We prefer joy and thankfulness and peace, and all of those are good things. But actually these negatives are part of our human experience in this broken world. And therefore we're part of Jesus' experience of our world as well. As the incarnation, he was fully God and fully human. We can grieve over many things. Grief is a response to losing something that we love or treasure. It's used in scripture for lots of different circumstances. At one point Jesus weeps over Jerusalem, grieving for the things that will happen to it. But today we're going to specifically look at grief over death. I'd like to spend the first section of our time together looking at how Jesus encounters and experiences grief. And then slightly later on, we'll look at how Jesus is with us in our experience of grief. So, we're going to look at 3 scripture passages, places where Jesus encounters grief. Grief of a stranger, in the loss of a family member, and in the death of a beloved friend. I'm going to read each scripture passage and then just pull out a couple of thoughts. As I read them, I invite you to picture yourself in this story as an onlooker, as somebody involved, and to kind of consider what it might have looked like and felt like to be part of this story. So, the first passage from Luke chapter 7. Soon afterwards, Jesus went to a town called Nain, and his disciples and a large crowd went along with him. As he approached the town gate, a dead person was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow. And a large crowd from the town was with her. When the Lord saw her, his heart went out to her, and he said, "Don't cry." Then he went up and touched the coffin, and those carrying it stood still. He said, "Young man, I say to you, get up." The dead man sat up and began to talk, and Jesus gave him back to his mother. Now, when you picture this funeral procession in first century Israel Palestine, I'd like you to lose your preconceptions of 21st century Britain. Funeral processions in this time and this place are not silent, somber walks. They are noisy. There is wailing, there is tearing of clothes, painting the face and the body with ashes. And in the middle of all of this noise and activity, Jesus picks out the grieving mother. And the scripture says, his heart went out to her. Some translations say he was moved with compassion. My question in this story: why would you tell a grieving mother, don't cry? Although, given the funeral custom, it's more like, stop wailing, don't wail. Maybe it's the sort of thing you would say to anybody who is in grief. The sort of thing you say to a child who's fallen over and hurt themselves. Stop crying, it's okay. Or maybe it's an instruction to wail no longer. Your reason for grieving is about to be over. I'm about to raise your son. This woman is a stranger to Jesus. There's no record of him having visited Nain before, and he doesn't get even into the town before this funeral procession comes out. But Jesus is moved with compassion for her to act, moved by her grief, and restores her son to her. Matthew chapter 14. Herod had John beheaded in the prison. His head was brought out on a platter and given to the girl who carried it to her mother. John's disciples came and took his body and buried it. Then they went and told Jesus. When Jesus heard what had happened, he withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place. This is the family bereavement. John the Baptist was Jesus' cousin. And on receiving news of this, Jesus goes off on his own. And we are quite used in the Gospels to Jesus going off on his own to pray, but that is deliberately not the language that is used here. Let me read you that verse again. When Jesus heard what had happened, he withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place. We are told 3 times that Jesus wanted to be on his own, and there is no mention of prayer. Given that he's travelling by boat, it's possible that one of the disciples went with him, but that disciple is not mentioned. Jesus goes away by himself upon hearing the news that his cousin has been killed by execution. Jesus goes away to grieve. My question here is, why not bring John back? I mean, Jesus can raise the dead. Surely, when it's a member of your own family, that's when you would do that. Jesus has raised the widow's son and the daughter of a synagogue leader. Why not your own cousin? I don't know. I don't have an answer to that. But I would like to point out that resurrection in Scripture is the exception and not the rule. 2 of the 3 stories that we're looking at are resurrection stories, but there are many, many more times in Jesus' ministry where the dead are not raised. There are widows and orphans that Jesus frequently encounters, including the widow of Nain, and he does not give them back their family members. In fact, there are only 3 pre-crucifixion resurrections, and only one of them is someone Jesus is close to. Jesus' father Joseph does not appear in any of the stories of Jesus' adult life, which leads many biblical scholars smarter than I am to believe that he died before Jesus started his public ministry. This experience of death and grief is part of our human condition. And the very occasional instances of resurrection do not mean that Jesus did not experience grief or loss. Jesus loses his cousin, and he chooses to go and be by himself to grieve that loss. Its power to raise the dead does not mean that Jesus did not experience grief. This last passage is a long one, and I am going to read it in full. Now a man named Lazarus was sick. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. This Mary, whose brother Lazarus now lay sick, was the same one who poured perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. So the sisters sent word to Jesus, "Lord, the one you love is sick." When he heard this, Jesus said, "This sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it." Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. Yet when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was 2 more days. Then he said to his disciples, "Let us go back to Judea." "But Rabbi," they said, "a short while ago the Jews tried to stone you, and yet you're going back there?" Jesus answered, "They're not 12 hours of daylight? A man who walks by day will not stumble, for he sees by this world's light. It is when he walks by night that he stumbles, for he has no light." After this, he went on to tell them, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I'm going there to wake him up." His disciples replied, "Lord, if he sleeps, he will get better." Jesus had been speaking of death, but his disciples thought he meant natural sleep. So then he said to them plainly, "Lazarus is dead, and for your sake I am glad I was not there, that you may believe. But let us go to him." Then Thomas said to the rest of the disciples, "Let us also go, that we may die with him." On his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. "Lord," Martha said to Jesus, "if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now, I know that God will give you whatever you ask." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha answered, "I know he will rise again in the resurrection of the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live even though he dies, and whoever lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this?" "Yes, Lord," she told him. "I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God who was to come into the world." After she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary aside. "The teacher is here," she said, "and is asking for you." When Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet entered the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who had been with Mary in the house comforting her noticed how quickly she got up and went out, they followed her, supposing she was going to the tomb to mourn there. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and those who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. "Where have you laid him?" he asked. "Come and see, Lord," they replied. Jesus wept. And then the Jews said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. "Take away the stone," Jesus said. "But Lord," said Martha, the sister of the dead man, "by this time there has been a bad odour, for he's been there for 4 days." Then Jesus said, "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone. Then Jesus looked up and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I know that you always hear me, but I say this for the benefit of the people standing here. They might believe that you have sent me." When he had said this, Jesus called in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out!" The dead man came out, with hands and feet wrapped in strips of linen and a cloth around his face. Jesus said to them, "Take off the grave clothes and let him go." Just one thing to note before we get into the meat of this story. Jesus' previous interactions in Jerusalem, just 2 miles from Bethany, resulted in multiple attempts to stone him as a blasphemer. And so Jesus has been teaching and ministering out in the countryside since that point. Jesus is risking serious harm to himself and his disciples in returning to Bethany, which is why they say, "Are you sure that's a good idea?" And he goes anyway, because he wants to return. And when we get to Bethany, there's this scene of grief, which of course is different for different people. But consider these descriptions of Jesus' own response. He was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Jesus wept. Once more, deeply moved. Now, I remind you again, at this time and this place, grieving is not a quiet shedding of tears. The word used to describe Mary's mourning and weeping is the same word in the story of the widow, which is to wail. This is a culture of loud, vocalized mourning and grief. So when Scripture says that Jesus was deeply moved, this is not an internal reaction. It refers to a sound. It was a groaning and moaning sound. It's the same root as the word for thunder. So often our 21st century Jesus can be a bit emotionless or removed. Somehow very even keel, everything kind of washes over him. I think this passage goes that wide apart. Jesus feels and expresses grief in mourning for his friend. Now my question in this passage, Jesus knows the resurrection is coming. So why this response? He knows. He says at the very beginning to his disciples before they even leave for Bethany, Lazarus has fallen asleep and going to raise him. I'd like to suggest that this grief is the divine anger of the living God at the existence of death and the pain that it causes. Remember, death is the disordering of creation. Creation is meant to be good, to be very good. It is meant to honour God in all of its reflections and its echoes. God is referred to in Scripture several times as the God of the living. He is the source and the sustainer of all life. And so death, as the absence of life, is an insult to and a distortion of this good creation. And the pain that Jesus feels and sees those around him feeling results in this deep groan of anger and pain. And so Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead, restores life, restores that corner of creation to what it was meant to be. So in these stories we see Jesus moved to compassion by the grief of his friend, seeking solitude at the loss of a family member, and deeply troubled by the death of a beloved friend.